Around this time, the King of France passed away, and not long after, a new wave of chaos swept across the borderlands. Scottish forces, led by Edward Bruce, James Douglas, and other powerful nobles, marched into northern England with a large and well-organised army. Ignoring the fragile peace that had been in place, they moved through Northumberland, burning villages, seizing livestock, and capturing anyone they could for ransom. Only the castles stood firm against them, as most of the population either fled south or hid deep in the forests. When they reached the lands of Durham, the destruction slowed, not out of mercy, but because the people paid heavily to spare their homes. Even so, the Scots left with immense spoils, driving away herds of cattle and prisoners alike, before pushing further into the region of Richmond, where they met little resistance. Their advance carried them as far as the River Tees, and some rode beyond the town of Richmond itself, though they did not attempt to take it. Eventually, the army regrouped and began its return through the valleys and rugged passes, carrying with them vast amounts of plunder. Along the way, towns were set ablaze, crops were trampled underfoot, and entire communities were left in ruin. Prisoners were taken in large numbers, their freedom dependent on the heavy ransoms that would later be demanded. Fear spread so widely that even distant regions chose to pay tribute in advance, hoping to avoid the same fate. As these raids continued, political tensions within England began to ease temporarily. Agreements were reached among the king and his nobles, and some high-ranking prisoners were exchanged between the two kingdoms. Yet even these moments of negotiation were overshadowed by the ongoing devastation. Many captives were only released after enormous sums were paid, further draining the already struggling regions of the north. Meanwhile, Scottish influence expanded deeper into English territory. Areas like Tynedale submitted to the Scottish king, while raids continued across Northumberland and Cumberland. Entire counties were forced to pay tribute simply to avoid destruction. Emboldened by their success, the Scots began to look beyond England. In the spring, they launched a bold expedition across the sea into Ireland. Led by Edward Bruce and supported by strong forces, they landed and quickly gained ground, capturing towns and territories. With the support of some local allies, Edward Bruce was even declared king in Ireland, marking a dramatic expansion of Scottish ambition. Back in England, the pressure did not ease. Scottish forces returned again to raid Durham, plundering coastal towns and carrying off more wealth. Soon after, King Robert himself led a large army to besiege the city of Carlisle. For 10 days, the city endured relentless attacks. The Scots used siege engines, ladders, and various tactics to break through the defences, launching assaults on multiple gates at once. They attempted to fill the defensive ditches, build moving bridges, and even deploy large siege towers to overtop the walls. Yet the defenders held firm. Arrows, stones, and other weapons rained down from the city walls, repelling every attack. Despite their determination, the Scottish efforts failed. Their siege engines became stuck in the muddy ground, their ladders were thrown back, and their attempts to undermine the walls proved useless. On the final days, they launched a full-scale assault, attacking from all sides in a desperate effort to break through. But the defenders resisted with equal strength, and the attackers suffered heavy losses. In the end, whether due to approaching English forces or the realization that victory was out of reach, the Scots withdrew suddenly, abandoning their equipment and retreating north. Even after this setback, the conflict continued. Scottish forces attempted surprise attacks, including a nighttime assault on Berwick, but were again repelled. Raids resumed the following year, reaching deep into English lands once more. Entire regions were burned, and towns were forced to buy their survival with large sums of money. In some places, nothing remained untouched. At the same time, a far greater disaster struck both kingdoms. Famine and disease spread rapidly, bringing widespread suffering. Food became scarce and prices rose to extreme levels. Death became a common sight, and entire communities struggled to survive. Yet even in the face of such hardship, warfare did not cease. King Robert later sailed to Ireland himself to support his brother's campaign. Moving freely through much of the land, though he struggled to capture fortified towns. Back in England, internal divisions weakened resistance further. Distrust between the king and his nobles prevented coordinated action, allowing Scottish forces to continue their raids, with little opposition. Amid this turmoil, strange and unsettling events were reported. A total eclipse of the moon darkened the night sky, followed later by an eclipse of the sun, adding to the sense that the world itself was in upheaval. Lawlessness also spread, as local knights and bands of outlaws took advantage of the chaos, plundering and terrorizing their own regions until they were eventually captured and punished. During the uneasy pause in the war, events in Europe continued to shift. Pope Clement V died, and a new pope, John XXII, was chosen to lead the Church. But while the wider Christian world adjusted to this change, the border between England and Scotland remained as unstable and dangerous as ever. In the middle of Lent, on a dark night in early April, the Scots struck one of the boldest blows of the war. Berwick, one of the most important towns on the frontier, fell not through open assault alone, but through betrayal from within. A man stationed on the walls, Peter of Spalding, was bribed with money and the promise of land. He allowed the attackers to climb the defences at the point under his watch, and once they were inside, the town was effectively lost. The English inhabitants were driven out, stripped of nearly everything they owned, though only a small number were killed in the initial seizure. It was a devastating humiliation, and the fall of Berwick opened the way for even deeper Scottish domination across the north. That same season, other strongholds also slipped from English control. Wark and Harbottle surrendered after help failed to arrive in time, and Mitford was captured by trickery. Before long, most of Northumberland had been brought under Scottish pressure as far as Newcastle, apart from a few castles still holding out. Even Berwick Castle, though it resisted stubbornly against the town now in enemy hands, eventually had to submit because its defenders ran out of food. While these military disasters unfolded, new ecclesiastical rulings were also arriving in England. Important papal decrees were brought in and discussed, including measures about church law and restrictions on clerics holding multiple benefices. These decisions mattered to churchmen and scholars. But on the northern frontier, such matters must have seemed distant beside the reality of fire, siege, and ruin. In May, the Scottish army pushed farther into England than usual, and this campaign left a deep scar across the land. They burned towns like Northallerton and Boroughbridge, then moved onward to Ripon. There, they stripped the place of its goods and forced those sheltering in the great church to buy safety with a huge payment, rather than see the town destroyed in flames. After remaining there for several days, the army advanced again to Knaresborough, which they wrecked with fire, then combed through the nearby woods where frightened people had hidden with their livestock. The cattle were taken, the refuge lost, and the invaders kept moving. Skipton in Craven was plundered and then burned, and the whole countryside suffered as the Scots crossed through it on their return northward. They drove away immense herds of cattle and forced prisoners, men and women alike, to accompany the march. The poor were made to move the stolen animals towards Scotland, and there was almost no resistance. These were not mere raids for glory, they were systematic acts of destruction, meant to weaken whole regions, impoverish communities, and remind northern England that it could no longer defend itself. Not long afterward, England witnessed a strange and deeply unsettling episode that revealed the weakness of royal authority and the bitterness many felt toward the king. Around midsummer, an obscure man named John of Powderham appeared at Oxford and declared that he, not Edward II, was the rightful heir to the English throne. He claimed to be the true son of the earlier King Edward and offered to prove his right by combat. The story spread quickly, and though many dismissed him, some foolish or discontented people were willing to listen. Their readiness to believe such a figure says much about the king's poor reputation. Edward II was widely criticised for his character, his tastes, and his conduct, and many believed he lacked the qualities expected of a ruler. When the pretender was brought before the king, Edward mocked him, greeting him as a brother, but the man answered boldly, denying any kinship and openly accusing the king of false rule. That defiance sealed his fate. The man was arrested, judged publicly, and sentenced to a terrible death. Yet when he saw the punishment prepared for him, he begged to speak and explained how he had been led into this madness. He claimed that an evil spirit had first appeared to him in dreams, promising him pleasure, success, and worldly reward, and that those promises had seemed to come true often enough to win his trust. Later, he said, the same force had come to him in human form and urged him to claim the crown, assuring him that he would prevail if challenged. He was told to go to Oxford, bring with him strange tokens, and declare his right before the people. The spirit, he said, had promised that many hearts would turn toward him, because the king was not deeply loved. At the last moment, abandoned and facing death, he admitted he had been deceived. Then he was executed. To many chroniclers, the story was a warning about pride, delusion, and the devil's power to mislead the desperate or foolish. To others, it also reflected a kingdom so unsettled that even wild fantasies could briefly find an audience. Later that year, the church renewed its attack on Robert Bruce. Cardinals still in England ordered that in solemn masses throughout the realm, he and all those who supported him were to be denounced repeatedly as excommunicated. He was branded infamous, deprived of honour, and his lands, along with those of his followers, were placed under ecclesiastical penalties. Those who supported him, even in the next generation, were to suffer restrictions in holding church office. Scottish clergy and religious who favoured him were threatened in the same way. Yet none of this had the effect its authors hoped for. The Scots showed little concern for papal censures. They ignored the condemnations and continued their campaigns. To English churchmen this seemed shocking and rebellious, proof of a people hardened against the authority of the church. But in practical terms, the sentences changed little. Armies still marched, towns still burned, and the war continued according to force rather than decree. In Ireland, meanwhile, the great Scottish adventure was approaching disaster. Edward Bruce, who had been raised up as a rival king there, gathered his Irish supporters and a newly arrived Scottish force and moved toward Dundalk, hoping to strengthen his hold over the country and press harder against English power. But this campaign ended in catastrophe. His army was divided, and its separate groups were too far apart to support one another. Local opposition, even from men of humble rank, fell upon them in succession. One part was destroyed before the next could intervene, and then the second was beaten before the third. With Edward himself could make a difference. Finally, his own force was routed as well. Edward Bruce was killed and his head cut off after death. His body was divided and sent to the chief towns of Ireland. What had once looked like the beginning of a powerful Scottish expansion across the Irish Sea collapsed suddenly in blood and failure. Soon after, the war drew both kingdoms again toward Berwick. By 1319 it seemed, for a moment, that King Edward of England and the Earl of Lancaster had reached some kind of working agreement. Together they led a large army into Scotland and laid siege to Berwick. The first attack was fierce and nearly successful. English troops pressed so hard that some of the defenders lost heart and fled toward the castle. For a moment it looked as though the town might fall, but the English assault lost momentum and the defenders recovered. They regrouped on the walls, fought back with determination, and managed to burn the great siege engine that had been brought forward to undermine the defences. Once again, a promising English effort began to stall. At the same time, the Scots answered with the strategy that had served them so often before. Rather than risk a direct confrontation with the main English army, Thomas Randolph and James Douglas led a force into England itself. They burned the countryside, seized captives, and carried off cattle, driving as far south as Boroughbridge. Their movement caused panic in York. There, a force was hastily assembled under Archbishop William de Melton and the Bishop of Ely, along with a large crowd of clergy, religious men, townsmen, and others with little real experience of war. They marched out against the Scots near Myton, north of York. But they were badly organised and advanced in disorder across the fields. The Scots, seeing this confused host approaching, formed up in their usual compact fighting order and let out a terrifying shout. The English line broke almost at once. Then the Scots mounted and pursued them mercilessly. Clergy and laymen alike were cut down. Thousands were killed, many were drowned in the nearby river, and many others were taken prisoner and carried off for ransom. The disaster became infamous, remembered as a bitter humiliation in which an army of churchmen and townsmen was shattered by hardened raiders. When Edward II, still engaged in the siege of Berwick, heard what had happened in Yorkshire, he faced a miserable choice. He considered dividing his army, sending one part back into England, while keeping the siege in place, but his nobles opposed it. They did not want their forces split, and they did not want to risk battle under such conditions. So the siege was abandoned, and the king led his army back into England, hoping to intercept the Scottish raiders. But the Scots had already slipped away through the western routes, driving their captives and stolen cattle back into Scotland by way of the passes and valleys they knew so well. The king dismissed his army, and once again a major English campaign had ended, without decisive success. The suffering did not stop there. Later that same year, the Scots invaded again under Randolph and Douglas, this time striking after the harvest had been gathered into barns. That timing made the blow even harsher. In places like Gilsland, they burned not only houses but also the grain that the people depended upon for survival through the year. Men and cattle were driven away together. From there, they ravaged lands around Stainmore and passed through Westmoreland, leaving destruction behind them. After some days, they turned through part of Cumberland, burning as they went and returning north with another vast spoil. These repeated raids show just how helpless the northern counties had become. Warfare here was not a matter of one great battle followed by peace. It was a cycle of fear, loss, ransom, and ruin, repeated year after year until whole districts were exhausted. Before Christmas, wiser heads on both sides finally arranged another truce, meant to last 2 years, and it was proclaimed on the border at the beginning of the new year. Yet even peace could not spare the land from suffering. Disease and cattle plague, which had already afflicted southern England, spread into the north. Oxen and cows sickened and died quickly in great numbers, so many that there were too few left for ploughing and people had to use horses instead. Strange signs were also reported. Large numbers of dead fish washed ashore and were not touched by man, beast, or bird. In the south, birds were said to fight each other fiercely and then fall dead in unusual numbers. Many saw in these events divine punishment, or ominous warnings of worse to come. Such reports reveal the atmosphere of the time, a world already shaken by war, famine, disease, and political disorder, now interpreting natural disturbances as messages from heaven. Papal denunciations against Robert Bruce continued, but he ignored them as before. Then came another dark and disturbing rumour from beyond England. Across much of Europe, lepers were accused of being hired to poison Christian waters. Whether born from fear, hatred, or panic, these accusations led to terrible acts of violence. In this same troubled age, suspicion and cruelty moved easily through frightened societies. England itself was descending into a new crisis, this time not only with Scotland, but within its own ruling class. In the summer of 1321, a number of powerful English nobles, including Humphrey de Bohun, John de Mowbray, and Roger de Clifford, moved into the Welsh marches and seized the castles of Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser had become the king's closest advisor after the fall of Gaveston and was deeply hated. The anger against him was not just political. He had married into the great Gloucester inheritance and, through greed, manipulation and influence over the king, was believed to have pushed aside the rights of others so that he might dominate the whole estate. The barons who rose against him looted his castles, seized treasure and supplies, and placed their own men in control. They even took royal castles in the region, though they insisted they were acting not against the crown itself, but in defence of the law and the realm from corrupt counsel. Behind much of this unrest stood the Earl of Lancaster, whose hostility toward Despenser and the king had become central to English politics. The pressure became so great that the king was forced to hold a parliament in London and submit to the demands of his opponents. Hugh Despenser the Younger, along with his father and son, was banished and his property was confiscated. But the settlement did not last. Once the truce with Scotland ended, after Epiphany in 1322, Scottish armies were back in England, raiding into Durham and spreading out through the countryside. The Earl of Moray remained at Darlington, while James Douglas and the Steward of Scotland plundered in different directions, reaching toward Hartlepool, Cleveland, and Richmond. Once again, the people of Richmond, unable to rely on defence from their nobles, paid a heavy sum to buy the invaders off. During this crisis, northern knights went to Lancaster at Pontefract, ready to fight the Scots if he would support them, but he avoided action. He had no desire to take up arms, in defence of a king who was now his open enemy. As the months passed, Edward II slowly regained the initiative. By gifts, promises, and political manoeuvring, he won over London and many of the magnates and gentry of the south. He recalled the Despensers and restored them to favour. Their return made the coming conflict unavoidable. Lancaster's party responded by laying siege to the royal castle of Tickhill, and the kingdom moved openly into civil war. The king gathered a massive army south of the Trent, while Lancaster and Hereford tried to oppose him. But when the two sides came into motion near Burton-upon-Trent in the second week of Lent, Lancaster's forces quickly lost cohesion and fell back. The royal army advanced steadily, and though there was little large-scale slaughter at this stage, Lancaster's cause was clearly weakening. He withdrew north toward Pontefract and then farther on, hoping perhaps to find new support or even to reach Scotland. At this critical moment, Andrew de Harcla, the Sheriff of Carlisle, acted with speed and skill. Believing Lancaster might attempt to join forces with the Scots against the king, he summoned armed men from Cumberland and Westmoreland and moved south. Learning that Lancaster's army was approaching Boroughbridge, Harcla marched by night and seized the key crossing before the rebels arrived. He dismounted his men, placed knights and pikemen at the north end of the bridge, stationed others in dense formation opposite the ford, and arranged his archers for constant fire. It was a disciplined defensive position, carefully chosen. When Lancaster and Hereford arrived, they found the crossing already held against them. The battle that followed was short but decisive. Hereford and Roger de Clifford led the assault on the bridge, charging boldly with their men. But as they pressed forward, they were met by a deadly hedge of pikes. Hereford was struck down and killed almost immediately, along with several others near him. Clifford was badly wounded and barely escaped. At the ford, Lancaster's mounted men could make no progress under the storm of arrows. Unable to cross either by bridge or water, the rebel attack collapsed. Their whole formation lost order, and the chance of recovery vanished. Lancaster asked for a truce until morning, offering either battle or surrender the next day. Harcla agreed, but kept his men ready through the night. By morning, the rebel army had begun to melt away. Many of Hereford's men had fled after their lord's death, and others deserted as hope disappeared. Lancaster, Clifford, Mowbray, and those still with them surrendered. Harcla took them as prisoners to York, where they were held to await the king's decision. Edward II was overjoyed. He had captured the man who had long stood as the greatest challenge to his authority. Lancaster was brought to Pontefract, his own stronghold, and there the king took revenge. Without the broader process of Parliament and under the influence of Lancaster's enemies, especially Hugh Despenser, sentence was passed. Lancaster was condemned to suffer a traitor's death, though part of the punishment was remitted because of his high birth and royal kinship. In the end, he was beheaded. So fell Thomas of Lancaster, one of the greatest nobles in England, a man of immense wealth, vast estates, and royal blood. He had held several earldoms and once stood at the centre of opposition to Edward II. Now he died outside Pontefract, on a hill like a common criminal, though many later viewed him in a very different light. Stories spread that miracles were worked at the place of his execution. Pilgrims came there in large numbers, and a chapel was built. Whether as rebel, martyr, or victim of vengeance, his death marked a turning point. Others died with him or soon after, including royal enemies executed in the same town. As for Andrew de Harcla, whose stand at Boroughbridge had broken the rebellion, he was richly rewarded and made Earl of Carlisle. For the moment, the king had triumphed over his enemies at home. But the wider troubles of the realm were far from over. After the fall of Thomas of Lancaster, the violence did not end with his death. The king and his allies moved quickly to crush the rest of the opposition, and the punishments that followed were severe enough to shock even hardened observers. More barons and knights connected to Lancaster's cause were hunted down, executed, imprisoned, or driven into exile. Some were dragged to execution and hanged in public. Others were locked away for a time and later released, and a few escaped overseas to save their lives. What stands out most is not simply the number of men destroyed in the aftermath, but the atmosphere of vengeance that surrounded it. This was no ordinary settling of accounts after a rebellion. It was a deliberate demonstration of royal power meant to terrify anyone who might still think of resisting the king and the men now closest to him. Among those captured were several prominent nobles who had stood with Lancaster, or were swept up in the same disaster. Some were executed in the districts most closely tied to their own lands, as if disgrace itself was being staged before the people who knew them best. Others were imprisoned in York along with large numbers of knights, many of whom would later receive pardons. At the same time, the political balance at court shifted sharply. The king held Parliament at York, and Hugh Despenser the Elder, once driven out of England, was raised to the rank of Earl of Winchester. That promotion was more than a reward. It was a sign that the Despenser family, after exile and humiliation, had returned more powerful than ever. Their restoration confirmed what many already feared. The king was not moving toward reconciliation, but toward a harsher and more exclusive style of rule, centred on personal loyalty and punishment. While England was consumed by executions and political revenge, religious controversy was also stirring across Europe. Churchmen argued over whether it was heretical to say that Christ and the apostles had owned no property, either individually or in common. The Dominicans took one side, the Franciscans another, and even among cardinals and learned men, there was no single answer. To ordinary people living through raids, famine, executions, and civil strife. These debates may have seemed distant, but they reveal a wider world in tension, where authority was being challenged, not only in politics and war, but in theology as well. England was not isolated from that turmoil. It was part of a much larger crisis in which kings, nobles, churchmen, and popes were all struggling over power, legitimacy, and truth. In the summer of 1322, Edward II prepared another campaign into Scotland. But before he could act with any real force, Robert Bruce once again seized the initiative and invaded England. This time the Scots crossed by way of Carlisle and quickly spread destruction through the western districts. They burned the bishop's manor at Rose, ravaged Allerdale, and even plundered Holme Cultram Abbey, despite the fact that Bruce's own father had been buried there. Then they moved through Copeland and crossed the difficult sands toward Furness. The abbot of Furness came out to meet them and paid a ransom in an effort to spare the district. But even that did not prevent further burning and plunder. The Scots kept moving, passing through Cartmel and across more dangerous crossings until they reached Lancaster itself. There they burned the town, sparing only a few religious houses. Then, joined by Thomas Randolph and James Douglas with another strong force, they pushed even farther south, devastating the countryside and burning Preston as well. Some raiders went still deeper into England, reaching an extraordinary distance from the border before the whole army turned back north with prisoners, cattle, and huge quantities of spoil. What made this invasion so striking was not only the scale of destruction, but the ease with which it unfolded. The Scots ranged far into English territory, lingered around Carlisle for days, trampled crops, destroyed what they could not carry, and then withdrew at their own pace. They remained in England for more than 3 weeks. Soon after, Edward II marched north with a very large army and entered Scotland. But the result was painfully familiar. The Scots would not give battle. They withdrew before him, avoiding open confrontation, and the English army found itself struggling with lack of supplies and disease. Before long, the campaign collapsed. The English had to retreat, not because they had been crushed in a great battle, but because hunger and sickness were tearing the army apart. Men died from famine and dysentery as surely as from any enemy weapon. It was another costly and humiliating failure. Then came one of the most dramatic Scottish invasions of the war. After Edward's retreat, Robert Bruce gathered a much greater force, drawing men not only from mainland Scotland, but from the islands as well. In the autumn he crossed into England again by the Solway and moved through districts he had not previously devastated, aiming at territory that had been spared more by difficulty of access than by any English strength. Edward, hearing of his approach, called on Andrew de Harcla, now Earl of Carlisle, to gather the northern forces and come to his aid. Harcla obeyed and assembled a very large body of men from the northwestern counties. But even this response failed to bring the kind of united resistance England needed, as the Scots burned villages and manors, seized captives, and drove away livestock. The English command structure remained weak and confused. At one point, John of Brittany, Earl of Richmond, was sent out with his division to observe the Scottish movements from the high ground between Byland and Rievaulx. Instead, he was caught by surprise. The Scots attacked through a narrow and difficult pass, forcing their way up with courage and determination. Many of the English fled, and many others were captured, including Richmond himself. The blow was serious enough, but what followed was even more damaging to Edward's reputation. The king, who was then nearby at Rievaulx Abbey, reacted not with calm command, but with panic. He fled in haste, leaving behind silver plate and treasure in the monastery. The Scots arrived soon after, seized the valuables and plundered the abbey. Then they swept onward across the countryside, reaching toward Beverley and forcing yet another town to buy safety, with ransom money. Once again, England was exposed. its king unable to protect church, town, or countryside. Andrew de Harcla, moving with the northern levies in hopes of joining the king and driving the Scots out, found instead a scene of confusion and failure. With no proper royal army assembled and no clear plan to follow, he dismissed his men and sent them home. The Scots, meanwhile, returned to Scotland heavy with plunder, prisoners, and cattle after more than a month inside England. For Harcla, this seems to have been a turning point. He had served the king loyally and risen high through that service, but he now faced a reality that many in the north knew all too well. Edward II neither ruled effectively nor defended the frontier. Year after year, English lands were being burned, their people killed, captured, or ruined, while royal campaigns achieved almost nothing. In Harcla's eyes, the kingdom seemed to be drifting toward complete disaster. It was this fear that led him to make the most dangerous decision of his life. Early in 1323, he secretly met Robert Bruce at Lochmaben and entered into negotiations with him. The agreement they reached was extraordinary. Harcla pledged himself, his heirs, and his followers to support Bruce as king in a free and independent Scotland, and to oppose anyone who resisted such a settlement. In return, Bruce promised protection and support. The plan also envisioned a larger peace between the two realms. If the King of England accepted the arrangement within a year, there would be a religious foundation established in Scotland to pray for those slain in the wars. A great sum of money would be paid over time, and marriage ties might even be arranged between the two royal houses. Thomas Randolph swore to uphold the terms on Bruce's behalf, and Harcla swore in person for his own side. Written agreements were sealed, and for a moment it may have seemed to Harcla that he was doing what the king would not do, seeking a practical peace after years of ruin. Yet whatever his intentions, this was an act of breathtaking political risk. Harcla had made such a treaty without the consent of the king or of Parliament, and he had no legal authority to settle the fate of kingdoms on his own. When he returned, he summoned the leading men of his region to Carlisle and compelled them, more from fear than willingness, to swear support for the plan. Among many ordinary people in the north, the idea of peace on almost any terms was deeply attractive. Farmers, townsmen, and lesser folk who had suffered through endless raids were said to welcome the thought that Scotland might simply be left in peace, if it meant the borderlands could finally breathe again. But at court the reaction was very different. The king and his advisors were furious. To them, Harcla had not acted as a peacemaker. He had betrayed the crown, allied himself with an excommunicated enemy, and threatened to draw English subjects into open defiance of their own ruler. Once Harcla was declared a traitor, the crown moved swiftly. Anthony de Lucy was instructed to seize him by craft if possible, and promised reward if he succeeded. The arrest was carried out with speed and deception. Lucy and several armed companions entered Carlisle Castle under the appearance of ordinary business, while other men quietly secured the outer and inner parts of the stronghold. Then they confronted Harcla in the Great Hall, where he was sitting and dictating letters. Caught unarmed and taken by surprise, he had no chance to resist. He surrendered on the spot. There was a brief cry of treason within the household, and one porter was killed in the confusion, but the castle itself quickly passed into Lucy's hands. One of Harcla's men escaped and carried news of the arrest northward, but it was too late to save him. What followed gives this story a strangely tragic tone. In the hours after his capture, Harcla confessed repeatedly to priests and friars, speaking openly about his whole life. Those who heard him did not see a man corrupted by base treason in the ordinary sense. They appeared to have judged that, whatever crime he had committed in law, his motives were not wicked in spirit. Perhaps he truly believed he was acting for the common good, trying to end a war that had become unbearable for the North. But good intention was not enough to save him. Within days, royal justices arrived, and sentence was delivered in the king's name. Harcla was stripped of his earldom and knighthood, condemned to be dragged through Carlisle, hanged, beheaded, disembowelled, and cut into quarters, with his remains to be displayed in different parts of the realm as a warning. His final behaviour made a deep impression on those who saw it. When the sentence was pronounced, he answered calmly that his body could be divided as they pleased, and that he commended his soul to God. As he was dragged through the town, he looked upward with clasped hands, and at the gallows he spoke to the crowd, explaining the purpose behind his treaty with the Scots. He did not deny what he had done. Instead, he tried to frame it as an attempt to save the realm from endless bloodshed. Then, he underwent the full punishment. It was a brutal end for a man who, only a short time earlier, had been one of the king's great champions and had won fame by crushing Lancaster at Boroughbridge. His rise had been dramatic, but his fall was even more so. And just as quickly as he was destroyed, those who had arrested him were rewarded with lands and royal favour. At the same time, another major religious conflict was unfolding within the church. A papal bull declared it false and heretical to insist that Christ and the apostles had possessed no property at all. This ruling struck directly at ideas strongly associated with the Franciscans and their defence of apostolic poverty. One leading Franciscan appealed against the decision, and this dispute would continue to deepen in the years ahead. New papal letters followed, clarifying the issue, revoking earlier interpretations, and insisting that these rulings be taught publicly. Once again, the age was marked by struggle over authority at every level. Kings battled nobles, England battled Scotland, the Pope battled dissenting theological ideas, and across Europe, no institution seemed fully secure. In 1323 and 1324, there were at least signs that exhaustion was finally pushing England and Scotland toward a more lasting pause. Representatives from both kingdoms met at Newcastle to discuss peace, or, at minimum, a longer truce. On the English side stood Aymer de Valence, Hugh Despenser the Younger, and other leading figures. On the Scottish side came the Bishop of St Andrews, Thomas Randolph, and others with full authority to negotiate. They quickly agreed on a truce of 13 years. When the arrangement became public, it was proclaimed in both kingdoms. Yet even this peace was cautious and limited. Because the Scots still lay under excommunication, ordinary trade and travel between the realms remained forbidden unless conducted under special written permission. Officials were appointed on both sides of the border to control such movement, and patrols watched the frontier closely. The war had paused, but the hostility had not truly vanished. Beyond the border, new tensions were also shaping English politics. The King of France moved against Gascony and other overseas possessions of the English crown because Edward II had failed to perform the expected homage for the lands he held there. In response, Edward sent his half-brother Edmund, Earl of Kent, with forces to defend those territories. Around the same time, changes in the English church continued. With the death of the Bishop of Carlisle and a disputed succession that was ultimately decided by papal appointment rather than local choice. These developments might seem separate from the wars of the North, but they formed part of the same larger picture. Edward II's realm was stretched in every direction, burdened by foreign threats, internal conflict, and deep mistrust among elites. Then, the story turned toward one of the greatest political dramas of the reign, the growing estrangement between Edward II and Queen Isabella. On the surface, her journey to France was supposed to help settle the dispute between the kings of England and France. But beneath that official mission lay a more personal and dangerous motive. Hugh Despenser the Younger, now the king's dominant advisor, was said to be working at the papal court to secure a divorce between Edward and Isabella. Men were sent to support this effort, and the Queen's own position was steadily undermined. Lands and revenues once granted to her were taken back. Her household was reduced. She was given only a restricted income to maintain herself and her court. Even worse, the wife of Hugh Despenser was effectively placed over her, controlling access and correspondence. Isabella was humiliated, watched, and stripped of the independence expected of a queen. Her resentment deepened, and her desire to go to France became not simply diplomatic, but strategic. Once in France, Isabella acted with far more intelligence and purpose than her enemies perhaps expected. She arranged for her son, the young Edward, heir to the English throne, to cross the Channel and perform homage to the French king for the English lands overseas. This would, in theory, smooth the dispute over Gascony and secure those territories. The prince was made Duke of Aquitaine, and the move gave Isabella a powerful new position. Yet even here, conflict followed. When the prince's agents attempted to take control of the lands in his name, the men already holding them for Edward II resisted. They would not yield authority, and disagreement broke out between the servants of the father and those of the son. What had begun as an attempt to resolve a foreign quarrel was turning into something much more dangerous: the beginning of an open split within the English royal family itself. And that is what makes this whole period so powerful in a documentary sense. It is not simply a tale of raids, executions, and treaties. It is the story of a kingdom unravelling under pressure from every side. The north was ravaged again and again by Scottish invasion. The king destroyed his domestic enemies with harsh and often vindictive justice. His own trusted commander tried to force peace and died as a traitor for it. Abroad, the papacy was locked in fierce disputes over theology and power. France was pressing English lands overseas. And within Edward's own household, resentment, humiliation, and political calculation were beginning to produce a crisis that would soon shake the throne itself. By the mid-1320s, England was no longer simply fighting Scotland. It was entering a far deeper breakdown, one that would soon transform the fate of the king, the queen, and the realm. As the crisis deepened, England filled with rumours. Word spread that Queen Isabella was preparing to return from abroad, not quietly, but with her son and with armed support, determined to take vengeance on the men who had dominated the kingdom in the king's name. At the centre of that hatred stood Hugh Despenser, the younger, his father, the Earl of Winchester, and Robert de Baldock, men widely blamed for the destruction of good government, the execution of Lancaster, and the misery that had overtaken the realm. Edward II understood the danger. He ordered the ports watched closely, fearing that the Queen might indeed cross the Channel with soldiers and allies. Yet even as the king tried to prepare, opinion within England was divided. Some believed Isabella had betrayed her husband and kingdom. Others believed she was acting for the safety of the realm, trying to remove the men whose influence had poisoned the crown. That uncertainty reveals how far the kingdom had already drifted from stability. Even the Queen's return could be seen at once as treason and as rescue. The king's government reacted with open hostility. Proclamations declared that if the Queen or even her son, the heir to the throne, entered England, they were to be seized as enemies. There were also reports that money had been sent to powerful men overseas in hopes of having Isabella and the young prince captured and handed over before they could act. But the plan failed. She was warned in time, and she found protection through the Count of Hainault. There, a new alliance was forged, one that would change English history. It was agreed that her son, the young Duke of Aquitaine and heir to England, would marry the Count's daughter. In return, support would be given to help the Queen and the Prince cross safely into England. It was a carefully judged political move, one that gave Isabella soldiers, legitimacy, and a continental partner at exactly the moment she needed them. When she finally landed on the eastern coast of England in September 1326, Her force was not especially large. It was far smaller than the panic in England had suggested. She came with her son, with men from Hainault, with Roger Mortimer, who had once fled for his life, with Edmund, Earl of Kent, the king's own brother, and with several others who had either been exiled or pushed aside in the years of dispenser rule. Yet numbers alone did not matter now. What mattered was momentum. Almost immediately, major figures began to join her cause. The Earl Marshal came over. Henry, Earl of Leicester, brother of the executed Thomas of Lancaster, joined as well. Soon other earls, barons, and much of the population in the south were moving in her direction. This was not simply an invasion, it was a political collapse happening in real time. The king still possessed the title and the crown, but support for his government was dissolving around him with astonishing speed. One of the clearest signs of that collapse came in London. The capital had long resented the king's circle, and especially those who had burdened the city with harsh demands and financial pressure. In that atmosphere of rage, the Bishop of Exeter, who was serving as treasurer and was deeply associated with the king's party, was seized by the people of London and brutally beheaded. The violence did not stop there. The crowd turned against the Tower of London, which held not only the wife of Hugh Despenser, but also a number of prisoners connected with Lancaster's old party. Men inside the tower, realizing what was happening and seeing which way the wind was blowing, surrendered it to the citizens. It was then placed in the hands of the king's younger son, John of Eltham, still only a boy, to hold in the name of his mother and brother. The symbolism of the moment was extraordinary. One centre of royal power had passed, not through formal command from Edward II, but through the force of public uprising and the growing authority of the Queen's faction. As Isabella's supporters pressed forward, the king's chief allies began to fall. Hugh Despenser the Elder, the Earl of Winchester, was captured at Bristol. His death was staged as both punishment and public humiliation. He was drawn in his coat of arms, a deliberate insult meant to dishonour not only the man but his lineage and reputation. Then he was hanged and beheaded. Soon after, the Earl of Arundel, another major supporter of the king and connected to the Despensers by marriage, was also captured and put to death. At the same time, the political map of England was being redrawn. Prisoners who had been held because of their loyalty to Lancaster were freed. Exiles were recalled. Lands and inheritances that had been taken away were restored. Men who had once been broken or driven out by Edward's government returned eagerly and gladly to the Queen's side. Isabella's movement was no longer merely a challenge. It was becoming a national reversal of the entire order that had governed England in recent years. Meanwhile, the hunt for the king himself continued. Henry of Leicester, Roger Mortimer, and John of Hainault drove westward in pursuit, determined to prevent Edward, Hugh Despenser the Younger, and Robert de Baldock from escaping overseas. Ireland was a particular fear. If the king reached it, he might gather forces there and perhaps even combine with Scottish support to return and plunge England into an even greater war. In desperation, Edward had already shown how far he was willing to go. Alarmed by Isabella's landing and the support gathering around her, he had reportedly made sweeping promises to the Scots, offering not only to recognise Scotland's freedom, but even to surrender northern English lands as the price of military help. It was a remarkable sign of weakness and confusion. The man who had never been able to defend the north now appeared willing to buy support by giving away what he had failed to protect. Yet even this desperate plan came to nothing. He could not reach Ireland. His following scattered. The king, who had once ruled all England, found himself wandering across Wales, houseless, anxious, and increasingly abandoned. At last, Edward was captured, along with Hugh Despenser the Younger and Robert de Baldock, before the end of November. the king was taken to Kenilworth Castle and held there under close guard. Hugh Despenser met a far more terrible end. He was executed at Hereford with the full force of the traitor's punishment. His body was cut apart and distributed to different cities, while his head was displayed in London. Robert de Baldock, as a cleric, was spared that sort of public execution, but he too was destroyed by the fall. He was imprisoned in Newgate and died there not long after. In a matter of weeks, the regime that had seemed so dominant had been broken. The king was a captive. His chief advisor was dead. His administrative right hand had died in prison. The government that had ruled England through fear, exclusion and vengeance had collapsed under the weight of its own unpopularity. After Christmas, the victors moved to give that collapse legal and political form. A parliament was held in London, and at its opening, 2 bishops were sent to Kenilworth to ask Edward to come and meet his people, to take part in what needed to be done for the crown and the realm. The request was framed with humility, but Edward refused entirely. He would not come among those he regarded as enemies and traitors. That refusal mattered enormously. It made it easier for his opponents to present the next steps not as an act of rebellion, but as a necessary response to a king who would no longer govern. When the bishops returned to Westminster and reported his answer, before clergy and people alike, the mood was ready for a final break. The days that followed were carefully shaped through ceremony, preaching, and public declaration. One bishop spoke on the ruin brought by a foolish king and dwelt on Edward's weakness, his childish conduct, and the disasters that had overtaken England during his reign. The people responded that they would no longer have such a man to rule over them. Another sermon described England's misery under a feeble head. Then the Archbishop of Canterbury spoke, invoking the old idea that the voice of the people was the voice of God. At last, he announced that Edward was deposed and would reign no more, and that his eldest son should succeed him. This was not treated as a private coup arranged by a few magnates. It was presented as a national act, agreed by earls, barons, bishops, clergy, and commons together. Whether that unity was complete or not, the performance of unanimity was essential. The deposition of a king required more than force. It required a story powerful enough to justify what had once seemed unthinkable. A formal delegation was then sent to Edward to renounce homage and inform him that he had been removed from royal dignity. The group was deliberately broad and symbolic, including bishops, earls, barons, abbots, priors, judges, friars, knights, citizens, and representatives of the ports. It was meant to show that the entire political community of England had turned away from him. Soon after, preparations were made for the coronation of his son. The young Edward, not yet fully grown, was to be crowned at Westminster with all the magnificence suitable to a king. The ceremony took place at the start of February 1327. It marked the beginning of a new reign, but not yet a new peace. Even on the night of the coronation, the dangers surrounding the kingdom were obvious. The Scots, already alert to events in England, attacked Norham Castle with ladders, hoping to surprise one of the key strongholds on the frontier. Some of them managed to scale the walls, but the garrison had been warned by a Scot inside the castle who turned against them, and the defenders reacted quickly. Several attackers were killed and others taken alive, though wounded. To some observers, this failed assault looked like an omen. The new king had not yet settled on his throne, and already the old enemy on the border was probing for advantage. It was a reminder that the overthrow of Edward II did not solve England's wider troubles. It only changed who would now have to face them. The Scots certainly did not hesitate. Hearing that Edward II had been deposed and his son crowned, and knowing that the old king who had once been desperate enough to offer them extraordinary concessions was now helpless in captivity, they invaded England again that summer. This time, they came in 3 divisions under experienced leaders: Thomas Randolph, James Douglas, and the Earl of Mar. Their movement carried not only military force, but political calculation. There were still those in England who might have preferred the old king restored, and some in Scotland may have hoped that confusion in England could still be used to reshape the whole balance of power. Robert Bruce himself did not lead this campaign, weakened as he now was by disease, but his lieutenants hardly needed him on the field. They knew England's weakness, they knew the land, and they knew that the kingdom across the border was changing rulers in the middle of war. What makes this moment so dramatic is the way several histories collide at once. On one level, it is the story of a queen returning from exile, gathering allies and bringing down a hated regime. On another, it is the collapse of a king whose rule had alienated nobles, clergy, cities, and commons alike. At the same time, it is the continuation of the long Anglo-Scottish struggle, now unfolding in the middle of English Revolution. Edward II fell not in a time of peace, but in a time when Scotland remained undefeated, the north remained vulnerable, and the future of the kingdom was still uncertain. Isabella and Mortimer could remove a king, destroy the Despensers, and raise a new ruler to the throne, but they inherited all the dangers that had helped bring the old regime down. When news spread that Scottish forces had crossed south again, the new young king moved quickly. He gathered an army and advanced into the north, determined to prove that this reign would not begin in weakness. The campaign brought the English into the rough country around Barnard Castle and Stanhope Park, where the Scots used the land to their advantage. They refused to stand in the open and would not offer the kind of battle the English wanted. Instead, they stayed among woods and broken ground, forcing the English to chase shadows rather than strike a clear blow. At one point, the king made an exhausting rapid march with part of his army toward Haydon Bridge, hoping to cut off the enemy's road back to Scotland. It was an energetic and ambitious move, especially for a ruler so young, and it showed real determination. Yet the Scots held their position, and the king was drawn back again toward their camp. Many later believed that if he had attacked at once, before delay and uncertainty took hold, he might well have crushed them. Instead, the opportunity slipped away. The Scots were in difficulty, and this was widely understood afterward. Their supplies were poor, they were losing men and horses, and the country around them could not sustain them for long. They had taken some plunder, but not enough to free them from growing hardship. Even so, the English command hesitated. Bad advice from senior officers led to delay after delay, while the king remained between the Scots and the road north. What might have become a decisive victory slowly turned into another missed chance. Then, in the darkness of one night, the Scots suddenly vanished. It was said that an Englishman in the king's army had secretly warned them that an assault was planned for the following morning. Whether that was true or not, the result was the same. They quietly broke camp, moved around the English position, and escaped towards Scotland. The whole episode became a bitter lesson in how hesitation can ruin a campaign that seemed almost won. During those tense days in the north, there was also one daring exploit that passed quickly into story. James Douglas, always one of the boldest commanders on the Scottish side, slipped by night deep into the English camp with a small picked force. He came so close that he nearly reached the king's own tent. Then, as he withdrew, he revealed who he was. Cut down men who had been taken by surprise, and escaped unharmed. It was exactly the kind of action that increased his fearsome reputation. More than a raid, it was a statement. Even surrounded by a royal army, the Scots could still move with confidence, strike suddenly, and disappear before the English could respond. For the English king, it was another humiliation in a campaign that had promised much more. When Edward learned that the Scots had slipped away, he is said to have wept in frustration. He had thrown his strength into the chase and had come so close to trapping them. only to see the whole effort end in failure. The army was dismissed, and the young king returned south. John of Hainault also withdrew with his men and went home. Yet the trouble did not end when the English army dispersed. Once the king had gone, the Scots gathered themselves again and laid waste to much of Northumberland, sparing only the castles. They remained there for a considerable time, raiding and destroying as before. The people of the nearby English border districts, seeing clearly that no immediate relief was coming, chose the only option left to them. They sent envoys and bought a truce with money, securing a temporary peace through payment rather than protection. That decision says everything about the condition of the frontier. Local communities no longer expected safety from military success. They expected survival, if possible, through ransom. Around the same time, another strange and dangerous current was moving through England. A Dominican friar named Thomas of Dunherved, who had earlier been involved in the failed attempt to secure a divorce between Edward II and Queen Isabella, now began travelling through the realm, trying to stir support for the deposed king. He moved both secretly and openly, encouraging people in different regions to rise and restore Edward to the throne. He promised help would come quickly, and he tried to awaken old loyalties or perhaps old resentments. But the promises came to nothing. No rescue force appeared. No movement strong enough took shape, and at last the friar himself was arrested. He was thrown into prison and died there. His failure showed that while some sympathy for the old king still survived, it was scattered, weak, and unable to reverse what had already happened. Not long after, the deposed Edward II died in captivity. Whether his death came naturally or through violence was already uncertain in the telling, and that uncertainty would follow his memory for generations. What mattered immediately was that his reign was truly over. He was buried at Gloucester among the monks rather than in London with the other kings. A powerful sign that he had not simply died as a crowned monarch, but as one who had been removed from rule. Even in death, his political fall shaped the treatment of his body and memory. The kingdom had cast him down, and burial itself became part of that judgment. While England was still absorbing the consequences of deposition and war, diplomacy again began to move between England and Scotland. Envoys were appointed to discuss whether the earlier long truce might be confirmed, whether a shorter arrangement could be made, or whether something more lasting might at last be achieved. At the same time, another major dynastic event was unfolding. Around Christmas, John of Hainault returned to England, bringing with him Philippa, daughter of the Count. Edward III married her soon afterward at York, with all the display appropriate to a royal union. The marriage strengthened the young king's continental ties and helped confirm the alliance that had supported his mother's return to England. It also signalled that the new regime was trying to settle itself, turning from rebellion and collapse toward the more stable language of marriage, diplomacy, and rule. Yet Europe itself was shifting in ways that would draw England into even larger struggles. The King of France died without a direct heir, just as his brother had before him. Edward III, still very young, now stood in a position that could be interpreted as giving him a claim to the French throne through his mother's blood. But the French did not accept that line of succession. Instead, they raised another prince of the royal house. The issue would later become explosive, but at this moment it already created urgency. Those around the young king, especially his mother, Isabella, and Roger Mortimer, understood that England could not hope to challenge France seriously, while war with Scotland remained unresolved. It was in that political atmosphere that one of the most important settlements in medieval British history was made. Edward III was compelled to recognise Scotland as a fully independent kingdom. By public act, he renounced all claim to overlordship, all rights of superiority, all demands for homage, and all pretensions that the kings of England had advanced over Scotland in the past. The old symbols of English domination were handed back as well. The Black Rood was restored. The famous instrument of submission, known for the many seals attached to it, was returned. Only the Stone of Scone remained in English hands, because the people of London would not allow it to be taken away. This settlement was not presented merely as surrender. It was justified as the necessary price of peace. England, it was said, needed freedom from northern war if it was to deal with France and other dangers. But whatever the reasoning, the result was unmistakable. What Edward I had once tried to force by conquest was now publicly abandoned. The agreement was strengthened by marriage. Edward's younger sister Joan was given in marriage to David, the young son of Robert Bruce. The ceremony was celebrated at Berwick with great magnificence and with large gatherings from both kingdoms. Edward himself was not present, but Queen Isabella was there, along with major bishops, nobles, and many others from England, joined by large numbers of Scots. It was a striking scene after so many years of bloodshed. For once, Berwick was not the setting for siege or slaughter, but for alliance. Even so, the peace had a practical calculation behind it. Those who arranged it believed, or at least argued, that unless England made terms with Scotland, it could never safely turn its strength elsewhere. Peace in the north was not only desirable, it had become strategically necessary. Meanwhile, the wider Christian world was again shaken by turmoil at the highest level. In Rome, under the influence of Louis of Bavaria, Pope John XXII was denounced and effectively rejected by those who accused him of grave error and even heresy. A rival pope was chosen from among the Franciscans, a friar called Peter of Corvara, who took the name Nicholas V. The Romans and the imperial side went even further, declaring that no pope should remain so far from Rome as John and his predecessor had done, and laying down conditions under which another could be elected if a pope abandoned the city for too long. These disputes belonged to the larger struggle between empire and papacy, but they also formed part of the same world in which England and Scotland were trying to end their own long war. Everywhere authority was being questioned. Kings were overthrown, popes were challenged, thrones and claims were being recast across Europe. In these years, the struggle over Scotland did not end with treaties, coronations, or the fall of great men. The conflict kept changing shape, pulling in friars, kings, nobles, and entire peoples until politics, war, religion, and personal ambition were impossible to separate. At the same time that England and Scotland were still circling each other in war, the Franciscan world was being shaken by a dramatic clash with the papacy. Friar Michael, the head of the Minorite order, had been held by Pope John at Avignon and ordered not to leave without permission. Yet he eventually escaped with the help of supporters linked to the emperor and his allies, leaving in the company of men like Bonagrazia and William of Ockham. Their flight turned into a public scandal. The Pope answered with excommunication, while Friar Michael issued a formal declaration to justify himself, and his protest was spread widely enough to be posted even in London. Beneath all of this lay a bitter struggle over poverty, authority, and doctrine. The Franciscans insisted that it was not heresy to say Christ, and the apostles had possessed no property, either privately or in common. Pope John condemned that teaching, and because Friar Michael defended it, he became a hunted man. So even far from the battlefield, Christendom itself was in turmoil, divided over who had the right to define truth. Meanwhile, in Scotland, another age was ending. Robert Bruce died, weakened by disease, after securing his place as the great architect of Scottish independence. He had prepared an impressive tomb for himself, and his death marked the passing of the generation that had fought hardest to pull Scotland out of English domination. His young son David succeeded him, still only a child. and although he had already been tied to England through marriage to Edward III's sister, that alliance did not bring peace. His accession itself carried uncertainty, because although Bruce had secured papal approval for the future anointing of Scottish kings, David was not immediately crowned and anointed. That hesitation reflected the uneasy condition of the realm. Scotland had gained survival and recognition, but it had not yet reached stability. The kingdom was still vulnerable, still divided by rival interests, and still filled with men who had not given up older claims. England, too, was far from settled. In 1330, another shock struck the ruling house. Edmund of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, uncle to the young king and son of Edward I, was arrested at Winchester and accused of treason. His downfall came out of one of the strangest and darkest episodes of the age. He confessed that he had been drawn into a plot to free the deposed Edward II and restore him, believing the former king was still alive. He claimed that this had been encouraged by churchmen, powerful nobles, and especially by the influence of Thomas of Dunheved and other friars, one of whom supposedly claimed to have raised the devil and learned from him that the old king still lived. It was a story born out of fear, desperation, rumour, and manipulation, and it ended in blood. Kent was condemned and beheaded with brutal speed. Many believed the real force behind his destruction was Roger Mortimer, who at that moment stood above almost everyone else in England, ruling alongside Queen Isabella and exercising power that seemed greater than the king's own. In such a world, even a royal prince could be swept away. Mortimer's dominance was becoming unbearable to many. Some English nobles, alarmed by his cruelty and by the way he and Isabella controlled the kingdom, withdrew to France to wait for better days. Then, in the autumn of 1330, the turning point came. At Nottingham, during a parliament, Roger Mortimer was secretly arrested by order of Edward III himself. The young king, who had so long been overshadowed by his mother and her ally, finally struck. Mortimer was taken to London, condemned, and hanged before the end of November. The charges against him were wide-ranging and devastating. He was accused of aspiring to the throne itself, of involvement in the death of Edward II, of causing the execution of the Earl of Kent, of helping surrender English claims over Scotland, and of maintaining an illicit relationship with the Queen Mother. Whether every charge was true mattered less than the political fact that Mortimer had become intolerable. His fall marked the moment when Edward III began to take his kingdom into his own hands. Isabella, seeing how the tide had turned, withdrew from power and was stripped of much of her authority and wealth, though she was still maintained in honourable comfort befitting the king's mother. Exiles returned. Lands were restored. The atmosphere of fear began to shift. The same year brought other signs of change. The rival pope, supported by imperial forces, submitted to the older pope and was received back under restriction, ending one phase of the great conflict over papal authority. A son was born to Edward III, named Edward, promising continuity for the English royal house. And in Scotland, David Bruce was finally crowned at Scone near the feast of St. Andrew. But even this ceremony carried tension. It was publicly declared that David's right was not simply hereditary, but rested, like his father's, on conquest. That was a remarkable claim, because it tied the legitimacy of the Bruce line not only to blood, but to victory. It reminded everyone that the Scottish throne still stood in the shadow of war. Around the same time, Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, who had served as Guardian of Scotland during David's minority, died. His death removed one of the strongest and most experienced defenders of the Bruce settlement. Donald, Earl of Mar, became Guardian, though his position was uncertain and his loyalties had already been suspect. With Bruce dead and Randolph gone, Scotland entered a dangerous and fragile moment. It was then that Edward Balliol made his move. He was the son of John Balliol, the earlier King of Scotland, and for men who had lost lands and fortunes under the Bruce regime, he represented both revenge and restoration. Balliol did not come alone. He had with him the so-called disinherited, men who'd been stripped of estates in Scotland, along with English supporters, foreign allies, and a small mercenary force. Their numbers were astonishingly small for the scale of what they intended. Some said they were no more than 1,500. Others put them only a little above 2,000. Yet they crossed the sea and landed in Fife, at a place where, it was said, no hostile force had ever been known to land before. That alone gave the venture an air of audacity. Soon after landing, they were attacked by the Earl of Fife with a much larger force, but Balliol's men beat them back. The following day they moved on to Dunfermline, and then toward the River Erne, where a far greater Scottish army gathered against them. What followed was one of the most astonishing reversals of the age. On one side stood the Scots, vastly superior in numbers and confident in their strength. On the other stood Balliol's small army, hardened, desperate, and trapped unless it could break through. The two sides faced each other across the river. Neither moved at first, but during the night Balliol's men crossed and struck the Scottish infantry with speed and violence. By morning they found themselves facing the main Scottish host on the open ground near Duplin Moor. The Scottish army was divided into two large formations and displayed all the confidence of overwhelming superiority. Yet confidence was not enough. The English archers played a decisive role, as they would so often in later wars. Their arrows tore into the faces of the leading Scottish ranks, blinding and disordering them, breaking their cohesion before they could properly support each other. In the brutal press of close combat, the Scots at first drove the English back. But discipline, archery, and stubborn resistance turned the fight. Once their first line buckled, the rest of the Scottish army collapsed into slaughter. The battle became famous not only for its scale, but for the horror described afterward. Thousands of Scots were killed or captured. Earls, knights, and leading men of the realm fell in astonishing numbers. Reports claimed that the dead lay so thick that the heap of bodies rose as high as a spear's length. Whether exaggerated or not, the image captures the scale of the disaster. Balliol's cause, which had landed on Scottish soil as a desperate gamble, was suddenly transformed by victory into a serious bid for kingship. The chroniclers, especially those hostile to Bruce's line, interpreted the defeat as divine vengeance for Scotland's defiance of the Church and for the sins of earlier years. Balliol, for his part, buried the slain at his own expense, an act that added a certain grim dignity to the aftermath. Then he entered Perth and rested his men, now no longer merely invaders, but contenders who had shattered the military prestige of the Bruce regime in a single astonishing blow. A few weeks later, Edward Balliol was crowned at Scone according to the custom of the kingdom. The ceremony was celebrated with great solemnity and rejoicing, and stories were told of miraculous abundance during the feast, as if heaven itself had favoured the event. Balliol also received the submission of important churchmen and nobles. The Bishop of Dunkeld promised support, several abbots came to terms, and the Earl of Fife, along with a number of knights, made peace with him. For a moment it seemed that the whole kingdom might turn. Yet Scotland was not conquered so easily. Many leading men still remained outside Balliol's camp, and though they had been defeated, they had not been broken. Seeing Balliol resting in unwalled Perth with only a small force, they gathered again and moved to surround him. Balliol's rescue came not from stable control, but from the intervention of Galloway, where his lordship gave him powerful support. Men from there invaded the lands of his enemies and forced them to abandon the siege. So once again, Scotland became a patchwork of local loyalties, divided authority, and rapid reversals. The fighting spread wider. Supporters of David Bruce answered by ravaging Galloway, while Balliol fortified Perth and tried to consolidate his gains. Yet his position remained precarious. The Earl of Fife, whom he trusted to hold Perth, was later captured through Scottish deception, and the town itself was burned. Balliol then moved south toward Roxburgh and eventually sought greater quiet at Kelso Abbey, with only a small household. That decision nearly ruined him. Andrew Murray, one of the most capable men on the Scottish side, shadowed Balliol constantly and struck when he seemed most vulnerable. By night, the bridge linking Balliol to his army was broken in hopes that he might be trapped or killed in the abbey. But Balliol's men moved quickly, repaired the crossing, and some swam the river in full armour to pursue the attackers. In the fighting that followed, Murray himself was captured, along with the feared mariner and engineer John Crabbe, who had long troubled the English by land and sea. It was a striking counterstroke. Balliol had nearly been caught, yet his enemies suffered the greater loss. Still, no victory in this period remained secure for long. Balliol sent representatives south to York to negotiate with Edward III, hoping to strengthen his position and turn military success into lasting alliance. Yet even while these talks continued, another disaster struck him. Near Christmas, Scottish leaders loyal to David Bruce launched a surprise attack on Annan, where Balliol was staying with a relatively small force. They found his men in bed, unarmed and overconfident, and burst upon them with ferocity. Around 100 of Balliol's people were killed, including men of rank, and Balliol himself escaped only narrowly, fleeing half-clothed and with little more than his life. The attack at Annan was a humiliation as dramatic as his earlier triumph. The king, who had seemed to conquer Scotland by a miracle of courage and archery, was suddenly driven out again, forced to seek refuge in England. Carlisle received him warmly, and many in the north still admired him because of the blows he had dealt the Scots. Yet, admiration could not hide the truth that his hold on the kingdom had again been broken. Even after such reverses, Balliol did not abandon his cause. In the spring he re-entered Scotland, this time with stronger English support, and laid siege to Berwick. Supplies came by sea. Cattle were driven in from the countryside, and the operation became a major joint effort. The Scots, unwilling to face him directly at first, answered by raiding English lands. They burned, killed, and carried off plunder in Northumberland and Gillisland, hoping to weaken pressure on Berwick by forcing England to defend its own frontier. English marcher lords replied with raids of their own into southern Scotland, and sharp fighting broke out around border villages and river crossings. The whole frontier became a zone of retaliation, where every movement on one side was answered by another on the other. Yet the centre of gravity remained Berwick, because whoever held that city controlled one of the greatest gates between the two kingdoms. By the summer of 1333, the crisis was reaching its peak. Edward III himself came north with a great army to aid Balliol, bringing with him his brother John of Eltham and a powerful host of nobles, knights, and chosen fighting men. Balliol was still engaged in the siege, and together the two kings pressed the city hard. Their assaults were fierce, but Berwick's walls were strong, and the defenders resisted with determination. The town had been fortified by earlier English efforts, and those same defences now served against English attack. Yet the siege did not loosen. The Scots could not simply let Berwick fall. To save it, they marched in great strength toward the town, advancing in 3 divisions. It was a bold move, but also a fatal one. The English and Balliol's forces had been warned and prepared their ground. What followed became one of the most crushing defeats in Scottish history. As at Duplin Moor, English archery proved devastating. The leading Scottish division was shredded by arrows, especially in the face and upper body, before it could properly close. Confusion spread quickly. Balliol's division, facing the first wave, broke it before the other Scottish formations could fully engage. The remaining divisions were then struck by the English in turn. Once the momentum of attack failed, the Scottish line dissolved. Men in the rear tried to flee, but mounted pursuers cut them down mercilessly. The slaughter was enormous. Earls fell, great lords fell, and thousands of ordinary fighting men died beside them. Archibald Douglas, one of the principal leaders of the resistance, was among the dead. Had darkness not fallen, still more might have been killed. Chroniclers described it as another judgment on Scotland, another punishment for pride and obstinacy. But even stripped of that religious language, the military truth remains. It was a catastrophe that broke the Scottish field army and opened the way for Berwick's loss. Stories gathered around the battle almost immediately. One tale claimed that before the fight, a monk in the Scottish camp cried out that he saw Christ himself coming from Berwick against them, brandishing a spear and warning them to turn back. But the Scots, trusting in numbers, marched on and met destruction. Another report told of newly made knights, almost all of whom perished in the battle, with only a handful escaping. Whether all such stories were literally true mattered less than what they expressed. To contemporaries, this was not just a defeat. It was a moment so terrible that it demanded signs, omens, and explanations. The dead lay across the field in such numbers that memory could not hold them without turning to symbol and prophecy. The morning after the devastating battle outside Berwick, the fate of the town was sealed. Its leaders knew there was no hope left. The defenders had seen their army shattered, their nobles slain, and their strength broken in a single day. So they chose survival over destruction. The gates were opened and Berwick was surrendered to the King of England. The terms were clear: the people would be spared. Their lives would be protected, their bodies unharmed, and their property, both land and goods, would remain theirs, except in cases where legal claims could be proven against them. It was not mercy born of kindness, but the practical end of resistance. The castle followed soon after. Earl Patrick, who held it, gave it up under one condition: that he would retain his title and lands, and that he would remain loyal from that moment forward. With that, the King of England entered Berwick in triumph. He took not only the town and its stronghold, but also control of the surrounding region, securing a chain of territories along the border. This was not simply a military victory. It was a political statement. Edward Balliol, now claiming the Scottish throne, confirmed that he would hold Scotland as a vassal under the English king, just as his father had once done. In that moment, the long struggle between independence and overlordship tilted sharply back toward England. The English king wasted no time reorganising the town. New officials were appointed, loyal men placed in charge, and investigations began to restore lands to English families who had lost them during earlier wars. But the changes went deeper than administration. The clergy of Scottish origin, who had angered the king during the siege, were expelled and replaced with English priests. Even the religious houses were not spared from this transformation. The shift in control was total: political, social, and spiritual. Meanwhile, far from Berwick's walls, the young David Bruce was forced into flight. Still only a child, he could not face the new reality unfolding around him. He withdrew to the safety of Dumbarton Castle, a remote and secure refuge. Before the battle, he had been offered a compromise. He could have given up his claim and received lands in return. But guided by his advisors, he had refused. Now, after defeat, that decision carried its full weight. At the same time, Edward Balliol moved to secure his authority within Scotland itself. In a gathering held at Perth, he took a dramatic step. He declared that all grants made by Robert Bruce were invalid. Lands that had been redistributed during Bruce's reign were to be returned to their previous owners, as long as those owners had not fought against him. It was a sweeping reversal of the political order Bruce had built. Yet even in this, Balliol showed calculation. Widows of fallen opponents were not entirely stripped of support, but they were given only a fraction of what they might have claimed, and even that came with conditions. Power was being reshaped carefully but firmly. Elsewhere, the kingdom was shifting in quieter ways. Important church leaders died, and their positions became contested. In Durham, 2 different men were appointed as bishop, one chosen locally, the other backed by royal and papal authority. For a time, both claimed the same office. Only death resolved the dispute, leaving the king's candidate in place. It was another reminder that even religious authority was entangled in the struggles of kings and politics. As months passed, Edward Balliol appeared to reach the height of his power. At Newcastle, in a grand public ceremony, he formally performed homage to Edward III. In front of nobles, clergy, and crowds, he acknowledged the English king as his superior and confirmed that he held Scotland under him. In return, he ceded large parts of southern Scotland, key counties and towns, permanently to England. It was a staggering concession. For a moment, it seemed as if Scotland itself might be reduced to a dependent realm. But this moment of dominance did not last. Resistance rose quickly. Many Scottish nobles rejected Balliol's authority, refusing to accept his submission to England or his reversal of Bruce's policies. They gathered forces, attacked his supporters, and reignited the war across the land. Even some who had once supported him began to turn away. The country fractured again into competing factions, each fighting for its own survival and vision of the future. David Bruce, meanwhile, sought support abroad. He travelled to France and placed himself under the protection of the French king, offering homage in return for aid. This move changed the wider balance of power. Now, the conflict was no longer only between England and Scotland. It became part of a larger struggle involving France as well. War in the north began to echo across the seas. Edward III responded with force. He gathered armies, marched north, and pushed deep into Scotland. Towns were burned, lands devastated, and resistance scattered. In some places there was no one left to fight, only empty villages and abandoned fields. Yet despite this overwhelming show of strength, the Scots refused to submit completely. They avoided open battle, retreated into difficult terrain, and struck where they could. It was a war of endurance as much as strength. At sea, the conflict spread further. French-backed fleets appeared along the southern coast of England, attempting to draw Edward's attention away from Scotland. Raids were launched, villages burned, and harbours threatened. But these attacks failed to gain lasting success. English forces responded quickly, capturing or driving off the invaders. The danger passed, but the message was clear. The war was widening. Back in Scotland, the struggle grew more chaotic. Some nobles accepted temporary peace, others rejected it entirely. Alliances shifted rapidly, betrayals, private feuds, and sudden attacks became common. One moment, a region might submit. The next, it would rise in rebellion again. Even within Balliol's own supporters, loyalty could not be taken for granted. A truce was eventually arranged, not because either side had achieved total victory, but because both were exhausted. Envoys from the Pope and the French king attempted to mediate, and a temporary halt in fighting was agreed. But beneath this fragile peace, nothing had truly been resolved. The core question remained unanswered. Who had the rightful claim to Scotland? Balliol or David Bruce? That question would continue to shape everything that followed. At the end of that same year, far from the battlefields of Britain, another striking event took place in the wider Christian world. Philip, heir to the King of Aragon and brother to the Queen of Sicily, entered the Franciscan order at Naples, with great ceremony. Kings, queens, and nobles gathered around what was meant to be a public act of humility. A prince laying aside earthly grandeur for the robe of a friar. The King of Sicily himself took part in the solemn occasion, and the Queen served at table. It was the kind of moment medieval chroniclers loved to record, because it showed that even among the highest born, the spiritual ideal of renunciation still held enormous power. Yet while courts in the south celebrated a prince becoming a friar, the north of Britain remained trapped in war, and the struggle for Scotland was moving into another violent phase. Before Ascension, Edward Balliol was sent back into Scotland with a fresh English-backed force. Important earls rode with him, and the intention was clear: to keep his claim alive and to restore his authority where it had begun to fail. Around the same time, an energetic stroke was launched from Edinburgh. John Stirling, who commanded the castle there for the English side, heard that Scottish forces under major nobles were besieging Cupar Castle in Fife. With only a small but determined body of mounted men, archers, and others from his garrison, he crossed the water in secret and struck with perfect timing. 2 nearby villages were set on fire. Panic spread, and the besiegers suddenly found themselves attacked from more than one direction, with the men inside the castle also rushing out. Believing a much larger English army had arrived, they broke at once. They abandoned engines, weapons, stores, and baggage, and fled. Stirling pursued them hard, cut down those he could catch, destroyed the siege works, and returned to Edinburgh in triumph. It was one of those sharp, sudden reversals that defined this whole period, where one well-timed strike could undo weeks of labour and completely change the mood of a campaign. At the same time, the conflict around Scotland was expanding into something much larger. The King of France was preparing fleets, troops, and supplies in support of the Bruce cause, because David Bruce had offered homage to him and accepted him as a superior lord if he could recover his kingdom. Edward III knew all of this. Young though he still was, he answered with extraordinary boldness. He sent word that if the French wished to come, they should land openly and fight. He even declared that they would be given room to come ashore and draw up before battle was joined. It was a challenge meant as much for reputation as for war. England's sailors were equally confident. They believed that if any foreign army did succeed in landing, those ships would never carry them home again. So while the sea routes were watched closely, Edward Balliol pushed deeper into Scotland and reached Perth. The town had been burned by the Scots rather than defended, but he repaired it and enclosed it with earthworks and a ditch, turning it into an English base in the heart of the kingdom. Not long after, Edward III himself came north from the south, where he had been waiting to see whether a French landing would actually happen. With only a small following, he entered Scotland and reached Perth, then moved even farther, driving beyond the mountains. Aberdeen and other towns were burned, crops nearly ready for harvest were destroyed under horse and foot, and the campaign spread devastation without meeting serious resistance. Soon after, his brother John of Eltham came north with more troops, joined by northern levies and marcher forces, and they swept through Carrick and the western districts that still resisted. They carried off rich plunder and burned widely, while William Douglas stalked the edges of the army, trying to wound and harass it wherever possible. Still, the English columns returned heavily laden, and for a moment the campaign looked like a demonstration that Scotland could be crossed and punished at will. But even at the height of this advance, the English position remained fragile. Edward III did not linger long at Perth. He went west towards Stirling and built a fortified post there, trying to turn movement into occupation. Yet this kind of war was ruinously expensive. He was paying not only for his own army, but also for the maintenance of Balliol and Balliol's supporters. So he summoned an assembly to secure taxes and aid from his kingdom, drawing money from towns, countryside, and clergy alike. The burden of the Scottish war was now being felt far beyond the border. Then came another blow. John of Eltham, the king's brother, died at Perth in September and was carried back to England for burial. It was a personal loss as well as a political one, striking the royal house in the middle of a hard and costly northern campaign. Edward III kept pressing. Experienced men believed that Scotland could only truly be subdued by winter campaigning. When crops were gone, movement was harder, and the land offered less shelter. So in autumn he pushed again into the west, around Bothwell. The local population, unable to resist, came into his peace more from fear than loyalty. Bothwell Castle was repaired and garrisoned. Elsewhere, English lords passed through Douglasdale and other difficult country, carrying off spoil. William Douglas continued to haunt the fringes of the army, killing stragglers and making every march dangerous. Yet Edward eventually returned to England, while Balliol was left behind at Perth with only a modest following. That fact alone reveals the limits of Balliol's power. Even as a crowned claimant, he still could not securely possess the kingdom without English force around him. When Parliament met the next spring, Edward III reshaped the English nobility on a grand scale, raising several men to earldoms and also creating his young son Edward as Duke of Cornwall. These honours signalled a monarchy growing stronger and more self-confident. But in Scotland, the news was less favourable. The Scots quickly recovered ground. Bothwell, which had only recently been repaired and garrisoned, surrendered. Other positions in Fife also slipped away. Galloway, where Balliol still had deep support, suffered badly as Scottish enemies struck again and again at those who held to his cause. So while England was awarding titles and planning new campaigns, the reality on the ground in Scotland remained unstable and often hostile. At the same time, Edward III's attention was being pulled in another direction. France had seized parts of his lands overseas, especially in the Duchy of Aquitaine, and the English government now decided that one force must eventually go to Gascony, while another continued the war in Scotland. This was the beginning of a much larger struggle. Balliol was called into England, and the direction of affairs suggests that Scotland was no longer the only or even the greatest problem before the English crown. Yet events elsewhere in Christendom still intruded into the chronicler's vision. News arrived from the east that the ruler of the Holy Land was willing to return sacred sites and wide religious rights to Christians, though never the temporal sovereignty of Jerusalem itself. It was a fascinating contrast. While Europe fought itself over kingdoms and inheritance, there were still dreams, however limited, of recovering the holy places through negotiation, rather than crusade. Back in Britain, the war did not pause. The Scots besieged Stirling, and Edward III rushed north by forced movement, hoping at last for battle. Once again the Scots refused. They raised the siege and melted away before him. At the same time, shifting loyalties continued to poison the border. Eustace Maxwell, who had recently been supplied and supported by the English king, went over to the Scottish side and stirred Galloway against Balliol and England. Dunbar Castle still remained untaken and continued to exert pressure on the surrounding district. Other strongholds, too, remained outside English control. This was the real problem with every English advance. They could burn, march, and terrify, but they could not easily make the whole country obedient. Suspicion and mistrust deepened even within Balliol's own circle. 3 Scottish knights who had once been with him were arrested in England after Balliol accused them of trying to persuade him to abandon his English allegiance and trust the Scots instead. Whether he feared betrayal or simply wished to prove his loyalty to Edward III, the result was the same. His regime looked increasingly dependent, uncertain, and divided. Soon after, the border flared again. Raids struck into England through Carlisle and neighbouring districts. Villages were burned, captives and cattle carried away, and only late arriving relief forces prevented worse destruction. There were even rumours that a noble in northern England had been secretly advising the Scots, telling them when it was safe to invade and when it was time to withdraw. Whether true or not, such rumours show how deeply trust had broken down. In a frontier war of this kind, information could be as deadly as a lance. The siege and relief of Edinburgh added yet another twist. Scottish forces surrounded the castle while its warden was absent. English and Balliol supporters from several regions moved together and managed to break the siege, restoring the position. But shortly afterward, the same warden was captured during a plundering sortie and taken away. This was the pattern everywhere. No gain lasted long, no stronghold could feel entirely secure, and every success was threatened by a sudden reverse. Meanwhile, Edward III opened negotiations with France, offering major concessions in return for peace, including marriage ties, temporary surrender of revenues, and even armed support for a crusade. The French king rejected these terms, and Edward answered by building a great continental alliance. He secured the support of the emperor, of powerful princes in the Low Countries and beyond, and of many others hostile to France. The war with Scotland was now becoming part of a far larger European confrontation. That widening conflict soon showed itself at sea. French-backed fleets moved against the southern coast of England in the hope that pressure there would force Edward to loosen his grip on Scotland. Yet the raids accomplished little. English coastal communities reacted quickly. Some attackers were trapped and destroyed, and not one of those who landed returned home. In the north, meanwhile, the Scots felt themselves too weakened for direct resistance, and many came into peace around August. Yet not all accepted it. Some of the most determined nobles remained out, continued raiding, and punished those who had submitted. The war was dividing Scotland internally, just as much as English intervention was ravaging it from outside. One of the most dramatic episodes came with the death of the Earl of Athol, who had become one of Balliol's key supporters. While he was engaged in siege operations, hostile Scottish forces came against him. Whether because of panic, betrayal, or poor fortune, many of his men fled, and he was killed with only a few remaining beside him. His fall was a major loss for Balliol's cause, and it again exposed how unstable that cause really was. Balliol himself spent the winter not in some great royal centre of Scotland, but at Eland in England, because he had no secure town or castle in Scotland where he could safely reside. That image says almost everything. He had been crowned king, recognised by England and supported by repeated invasions, yet he still had to winter south of the border because his own kingdom could not protect him. Edward III, angered by Athol's death, prepared yet another campaign. Yet before it could unfold fully, envoys from the Pope and the King of France arrived to try for peace, or at least a truce. A temporary pause was agreed, lasting until mid-Lent, while further discussion took place. The central question the Scots raised was the same one that haunted the whole conflict. Who, truly, had the better right to the Scottish throne, Balliol or David Bruce? Even after all the bloodshed, all the ceremonies, all the submissions and reversals, the war had not resolved legitimacy. It had only thrown rival claims into harsher relief. At the same time, another Franciscan controversy flared after the death of Pope John. Appeals and declarations were publicly posted against the Pope's chosen head of the order, showing that ecclesiastical struggles remained every bit as bitter as political ones. Then Edward III held another assembly and planned a new invasion. In the summer of 1335, the English and Balliol forces entered Scotland by different routes, with large armies and continental allies. They found little direct resistance and marched across the land, burning, wasting, and carrying off spoil. Some of the worst destruction fell not just on lay people, but on monasteries and churches. Even Dundee was attacked from the sea, and its Franciscan house suffered badly. This was no clean war of nobles alone. It consumed clergy, villagers, crops, schools, and whole local communities. There were also smaller but revealing episodes within the larger campaign. A continental ally travelling through Scotland with only a thin escort was ambushed repeatedly and eventually forced to surrender through lack of provisions. English raiders from Roxburgh, on the other hand, managed to capture the Earl of Moray, one of the leading Scottish figures. In the south, France and Bohemia prepared a much larger naval effort to distract England, though again it achieved almost nothing lasting. By August, many Scots, battered and unable to resist effectively, came into peace, but others still refused. They continued the struggle, attacked those who had submitted, and kept the country unstable. At the same time that Edward III was widening his struggle against France, the cost of war was becoming enormous. To keep his armies in the field and his alliances alive across the Channel, he poured out money on a scale that stunned contemporaries. Great nobles were sent overseas with large forces of men-at-arms, archers, and spearmen, while vast shipments of English wool were used to pay wages and maintain the campaign. Parliament and merchants alike were drawn into the effort. Wool, the lifeblood of England's economy, became the fuel of war. So much was being spent that people said the king was pouring out 1,000 marks a day, and some claimed even more. Whether the exact sum was true or not, the meaning was clear. Edward was gambling the wealth of his kingdom on a continental war and on the hope of breaking France by force. The expedition itself began with early success. English commanders sailing overseas encountered a large French fleet and captured many of its ships. Among the prisoners was the brother of the Count of Flanders, and Edward treated him with such honour that peace was restored between England and Flanders. That was a political gain as important as any battlefield success. But war was never tidy. Once the English landed in Flanders, they met armed resistance, drove it off with the power of their archers, and then saw some of their enemies take refuge in a church. When surrender was refused, the church was set on fire, and the men inside were burned alive. It is one of those episodes that strips away all romantic language and reminds us what medieval war often meant in practice. Terror, fire, and death even in places meant to be holy. Not long after, papal envoys arrived in England in an effort to stop the growing conflict between Edward and the King of France. The Pope hoped to impose peace before Europe was dragged deeper into war. Edward called together a parliament in London to hear the matter, but at the same time he was still thinking like a commander, not a peacemaker. Even while the talks continued, he sent powerful earls and barons north to support Edward Balliol in Scotland and to press hard against strongholds that still resisted. One of the main targets was Dunbar Castle, one of the most troublesome fortresses in the region, a place that held out stubbornly and threatened the surrounding countryside. The siege was organised with care. Trenches were dug, buildings raised, tents spread across the ground, and the castle was hemmed in as tightly as the besiegers could manage. It looked like the sort of operation that might finally bring one of the great northern strongholds to heel. Yet events elsewhere in Scotland quickly showed how unstable everything remained. John Stirling, the English-aligned commander of Edinburgh Castle, rode out in search of plunder and was captured by William Douglas through a sudden and clever attack. Douglas then brought his prisoners back before the walls of Edinburgh and tried to force the garrison to surrender. He promised life, safety and freedom if they yielded, and threatened brutal execution for Stirling and the others if they refused. But the men inside the castle held firm. They replied that the fortress belonged to the King of England and could not be given up without royal command, whatever happened to those outside. Douglas, for all his reputation, did not carry out the full cruelty he had threatened. Instead, he sent the prisoners away to secure castles still held by the Scots. The siege of Dunbar went on, and the English reorganised Edinburgh under new command. But the episode showed again that no fortress, no commander, and no line of control was safe for long. During the next Lent, another major Scottish figure passed from the scene. Andrew Murray, one of the most capable leaders of the resistance, died, though stories differed over how it happened. Some said sickness took him. Others claimed he was dragged to death after being thrown by a horse. However he died, his loss mattered greatly. He had been one of the few men able to keep the Scottish cause coherent during years of invasion, counterattack, and internal fracture. The Steward of Scotland took his place, but leadership in such times was never simple. Even as one guardian died, and another rose, Dunbar still held out. The Countess inside the castle proved herself every bit as determined as any soldier. When the English tried to use her captive brother, the Earl of Moray, to force a surrender, she answered with cold refusal. The castle, she said, had been entrusted to her lord, and she would not yield it. When the besiegers threatened to kill her brother, she is said to have answered that if they did so, she would simply become heir to the earldom herself. Whether sharpened by chroniclers or exactly spoken, the line captures the spirit of the defence perfectly. Dunbar was not going to fall through fear. Meanwhile, the wider war was drawing Edward III farther and farther toward France. Since peace could not be reached on terms he found acceptable, he prepared to cross the sea in person. He gathered a huge force of English troops in addition to those already abroad. Seeing the king's determination, the Scots asked for a truce, and one was granted for a year, though Edward reserved the right to break it if he chose. The earls besieging Dunbar, anxious not to be left behind while the king sought glory overseas, agreed to a truce there as well and withdrew to rejoin him. That pause in the north reveals something important. Scotland, though still dangerous, was no longer the centre of Edward's ambitions. France was becoming the main theatre, and the war for the French crown was beginning to overshadow everything else. Edward sailed in the summer with a great army, taking Queen Philippa with him. After his crossing, the Flemings moved decisively to his side, and he landed at Antwerp. Yet the campaign did not begin as the English had hoped. Promises made by German allies proved less solid when tested in reality. Edward remained abroad for a long time, paying enormous sums, exposed to danger, and achieving little of immediate value beyond political negotiations and the honour of being named imperial vicar by the emperor. The Pope rebuked him for allying with a ruler under excommunication and for other actions that seemed to challenge the order of Christendom. Edward defended himself through ambassadors, arguing the justice of his cause and the necessity of his alliances. These years were not just about armies moving on maps. They were about titles, legitimacy, theology, diplomacy, and the struggle to convince Europe that one's war was lawful. Even while Edward remained abroad, Scotland did not stay quiet. The truce was broken, and the Scottish leaders once again struck by land and sea against English positions and their allies. Cupar Castle and the county of Fife were lost, and William Douglas returned from France with fresh support to help retake ground. Perth was besieged and surrendered after only weeks, and then those leaving with the spoils were caught in a sudden storm at sea and drowned. It is one of those dark turns of fortune that fills medieval history. Victory followed almost immediately by disaster, as if the sea itself refused to let men enjoy what they had just won. Around the same time, Newcastle suffered a terrible flood that broke walls and drowned many inhabitants. Another reminder that the 14th century was an age in which war and natural catastrophe seemed to come together without mercy. On the continent, Edward at last advanced into France. He marched through enemy territory with a large army, burning and laying waste across a broad swath of land. Whole districts were ravaged in an effort to force the French king into battle. The challenge was accepted in words, but when the appointed day came, the French did not attack. Edward waited in position, ready to fight, but his opponent would not come on. So he withdrew into Brabant after devastating the countryside over a huge area. Once again, he had shown energy and boldness, but not secured the decisive battle he wanted. Even so, one major political gain followed. In Ghent, the Flemings recognized him as the rightful heir to France and swore fealty to him. From this point, Edward did something momentous. He adopted not only the claim, but the title and arms of France. He began openly styling himself King of France as well as England. The war had crossed a line. It was no longer merely a quarrel over lands in Gascony or influence abroad. It had become a dynastic struggle for the crown itself. Back in England, the burden of that claim was immense. Edward returned, demanded large subsidies, and obtained them. New charters were issued, liberties confirmed, and extraordinary taxation imposed in support of the war against both France and Scotland. The realm was being mobilised at every level. Soon after, he sailed again and won one of the greatest naval victories of the age off the coast near Sluys. Though outnumbered in ships, he crushed the French fleet so completely that thousands of enemy sailors and soldiers were killed, drowned, or captured, while English losses were comparatively light. It was a turning point at sea. When Edward landed afterward in Flanders, he was greeted with cries hailing him as King of England and France, and chroniclers even reported healing miracles associated with his royal touch. His reputation was reaching almost legendary height. From there, Edward moved on to Tournai, seeking another great triumph. He even challenged Philip of Valois in dramatic terms, offering single combat, a chosen battle between picked knights, or a full engagement between the armies. Philip rejected the challenge. In the end, despite all Edward's energy, a truce was arranged through papal mediation, because money was running short and the campaign could not be sustained indefinitely. Edward returned to England in anger and turned against officials and churchmen he believed had failed to support him properly. Tensions rose sharply, especially with Archbishop Stratford, showing that war abroad could quickly become political conflict at home. While these struggles unfolded, David Bruce returned from France and once again led Scottish forces into England. Northumberland was ravaged as far as the Tyne. Edward Balliol tried to answer, but accomplished little of note. Then Edward III himself invaded Brittany, took castles, besieged towns, and seemed ready for more, only for another truce to intervene. Returning from Brittany, he faced storms so violent that many ships were scattered or sunk, yet he himself remained calm throughout, earning admiration for his courage under danger. The image is vivid. A king at war with France, challenged by Scotland, quarrelling with churchmen, yet standing unshaken even while lightning and sea threatened to drag him down. In the years that followed, the rhythm of war continued. There were raids and counter-raids across the western marches, invasions into Cumberland, retaliatory burnings in Dumfries, and the constant cycle of cattle lifting, village burning, and brief incursions that defined the border conflict. Then, in 1346, Edward launched one of his greatest expeditions to France. He sailed with a vast fleet and landed in Normandy, where town after town was seized or sacked. Caen fell with terrible slaughter and rich prisoners. The French king, despite superior numbers, kept retreating and destroying bridges rather than risk direct battle. Edward pressed on, crossing rivers, burning the countryside and drawing his enemy northward until at last the two armies met near Crécy. Crécy became one of the defining victories of Edward's reign. The battle lasted through violence, confusion, and exhaustion until the French were utterly shattered. Great nobles fell, among them the King of Bohemia and many leading lords. Thousands died. The French king survived only by flight. For Edward, it was proof that his cause in France could be advanced by force, and afterward he moved on to begin the siege of Calais, the great prize he hoped to seize. It was one of the brightest moments in his military career. And yet, even while Edward triumphed in France, Scotland struck once more. In the autumn of 1346, David Bruce led a large army into England. The chronicler describes the invasion in dark, furious language, treating it almost as a visitation of evil. The Scots moved against Liddell's strength in force, surrounding it and preparing assault. For days they encircled the place, and then, at last, attacked from every side with beams, stones, clubs, and iron tools. They filled the ditches, broke the lower walls, and forced their way inside. The defenders fought hard, but the fortress was lost. Its governor, Walter Selby, asked only to die in a knightly way, if die he must. He begged that he might at least face one of his enemies in open combat. But his plea was refused, and he was beheaded instead. The chronicler lingers on the scene with horror, presenting it as an act of savage cruelty that cried out for vengeance.